When it comes to video game ports, the question is often asked, what happens when you take 5 legendary Mega Drive classics and port them to the technically superior Sega CD? You would expect enhanced graphics, CD quality audio and improved gameplay, and in a lot of cases that would be true, but it isn't all that's guaranteed. And that would be the case with the Sega CD 5-in-1 Arcade Classics collection, which would promise to deliver definitive versions of Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, Super Monaco Grand Prix, Columns and Golden Axe. But instead, many would see it as a masterclass in how not to handle classic game ports. But is it as bad as the reputation suggests, or are there hidden gems beneath the surface? If you take a look at Streets of Rage, for example, it would be a tale of two versions. If you look at the original Mega Drive edition, released back in 1991, it featured tight controls, responsive combat, and that iconic Yuzo Koshiro soundtrack that defined a generation of beat-em-up fans, and it set the stage for everything to come after it. It's still one of the best beat-em-up games simply ever made. But when it was ported to the Sega CD, the graphics relatively remained unchanged, still looked as awesome as ever, which isn't necessarily bad since the original on the Mega Drive looked fantastic. However, between the loading times between levels did help to slow down the momentum, but the audio quality of the music, while presentable in many ways, but instead the music felt somewhat compressed compared to that of the original. The controls in many cases felt slightly less responsive, and there would often be some slowdown with the overall gameplay. Plus the sound effects were very different, with attacks, punches, kicks, and even with enemy deaths that just completely changed the outlook of what the original was supposed to be, and for many it didn't feel like a good version of the game. So what would be the solution to the problem? Well, obviously the Mega Drive version, you would be better to stick with it. The Sega CD port does have some nice touches, don't get me wrong, but the changes that are there actually take away from the experience rather than adding to it. But if we further move on to Revenge of Shinobi, again on the Mega Drive, with it being one of the system's finest action platformers, pixel perfect controls and atmospheric audio, being among some of the best games ever released on that system. But then if we look at the Sega CD version, while relatively on paper, even visually everything remains intact, but again like Streets of Rage, it suffers from slow loading screens and interrupts, although the enhanced sound effects are actually decent in this one, with some of the attacks also having more impact, so there is some upgrades, and graphics are virtually identical, and they did look great anyway. But there are some subtle instances where the game just feels overly more difficult than that of the original. Now, not taking away that the original was not an easy game to play, which it was a very difficult game to master, but this version just felt somehow a little bit more challenging for whatever reason. While the audio might be slightly better, the pacing issues still remain the same. The pacing is what really lets it down. So if you were to compare the two games, both the 16-bit entry and the Sega CD version, like Streets of Rage, you probably would be better to stick with the original. we look at Super Monaco Grand Prix next, the Mega Drive original featured fast-paced arcade racing with smooth gameplay and satisfying progression, and for its time really did push the console to its limits. A very solid all-round good experience. But this is where things get interesting with the Sega CD version, as things have drastically improved. Yes, there are loading times on the CDs, which is inevitable, but you end up witnessing enhanced visuals, improved car and character sprites, and slightly better track details. Plus the audio CD elements also include some decent background music. Just the loading between races and the frame rates do dip, and that's the game's major issue. But the visual improvements are a plus, and if anything it feels more akin to the arcade original above anything else. But having spent time playing it, yeah, it's not bad at all. And in many ways it's hard to really compare between both of the versions. The Mega Drive would still be suitable for a lot of players, but this version isn't too bad either. So when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, while there are some issues with the games and loading screens, they're not all bad, in fairness. So if you look at columns next, and we all remember its simple addictive gameplay, that if you look at the Mega Drive original it loads instantly and keeps you in the zone, and then if you compare that to the CD version, it's still the same game, it's still fundamentally solid. The CD version does add some new background graphics and enhanced audio, which is nice. It just feels a lot smoother than that of the Mega Drive, in fairness. But again, like the other games here, the loading times are definitely its letdown. Plus I felt for myself personally that the game, even on the beginner difficulties, just felt that little bit more difficult, especially over time. But it still plays the same. You still have to match the colours and try to increase the scores while trying to last as long as possible. So if that's something you're into, either of these versions is worth a look, in fairness. Bear in mind the loading times. So if we take a look then at the final game on this list, with Golden Axe, the original on the Mega Drive being among one of the best beat 'em ups of that era, one of the best games on the Mega Drive, that also inspired thousands of imitators with its perfect blend of combat and magic, with fast and fluid gameplay, great graphics, great sound effects and background music. And in fairness, the Sega CD version does offer a lot of enhancements here. The sprites and backgrounds look identical, but the CD audio and remixes are actually quite good. But the only issue, as in with the rest of the games, lies with its loading screens between each levels, as it does tend to break up flow somewhat, and like Streets of Rage sometimes can feel a little bit laggy in the control department, where button inputs don't always react to timed presses and so forth. So that's what lets it down. Like, when you look at all of the games here, in the grand scheme of things, they nearly all feature improved and remixed audio tracks, visual enhancements, which is especially more noticeable in Super Monaco Grand Prix. All of the games do retain their core gameplay mechanics. The one good thing about this is that you have 5 classic games all on one disc, which is great for collectors. The only thing is, obviously, with the time of CDs, games like this here did suffer from excessive loading times throughout all games. The control responsiveness felt a bit lackluster at times, and in many cases, many would say that there was a lot of missed opportunities with the CD-ROM enhancements that weren't taken advantage of. Plus, in some instances, with audio compression, people would often find or say that the game often sounded worse than the original games. And as a collection, it didn't really offer any new content or features that were added, bar a few visual kind of tweaks. So all around, this 5-in-1 arcade collection does represent everything kind of wrong and lazy with ports in many ways, especially when it comes to 16-bit era games. And instead of leveraging the Sega CD's capabilities to create definitive versions of these classics, we got rushed conversions that actually detract from the original experiences. While hardcore collectors may want this for completeness in their catalogue, anyone looking to play these games should actually stick with the Mega Drive originals, as they load faster, they control better, and in many cases they actually sound better too, which they do. Most of us looking back, when we remember these games, we would always remember the Mega Drive editions over anything else, as they are essentially the most iconic. Well, they are for me at least. But this collection also serves as a perfect example of how technical superiority doesn't automatically translate to a better gaming experience. Sometimes the originals really are the best version to play. So realistically, this compilation, it does have its pluses, it does have its weaknesses, but who is it really for? Collectors and curiosity seekers. Anyone else outside that really should just play the original. But I would have to ask what you've experienced with any of these ports. Even what would be the worst classic game port that you've encountered over the years. It'll be interesting to hear your feedback and stories of this, so let us know down in the comments below. And make sure to keep watching and subscribe to the channel, as I will be covering a lot more of these interesting ports in future videos. And speaking of future videos, to see more of Sega's catalogue of interesting games, you should check out this next video.